In an effort to be more responsible with your feelings as a leader and to better navigate workplace hurt, it's really important to know what your emotional handicaps are. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase before, and maybe it's just something I made up or I've coined, but it's so important to know your emotional handicaps. So, when I say emotional handicap, I'm not saying that something's wrong with you necessarily. But what I am saying that as a leader who is first and foremost a human being, we all have challenges in processing through our emotions. And oftentimes those challenges can result in subsequent behavior that isn't always the best way of dealing with a situation. So, case in point, if someone offends you, maybe for some people, their first knee jerk reaction is to withdraw. Or maybe another person's reaction is to be cynical or sarcastic. Maybe someone else's reaction is to be defensive. So we have these reactions that are just kind of a knee jerk emotional response, but oftentimes they can be a handicap and a hindrance because we do it subconsciously, many times without thinking, and they really do end up creating bigger challenges, probably more so than the whatever issue was first introduced. So I think it's so important as a leader to be very self-aware and ask yourself, how do I handle conflict? How do I handle myself when I'm in a situation where either my feelings are hurt or I'm experiencing some kind of emotional or psychological issue? What is usually my worst response? And then I want you to consider some better ways of handling the situation, or even some kind of options you can slide in there that'll prevent you from going down the emotional handicap side of things. So, for instance, if your reaction is to become defensive, if something happens or someone says something to you and your natural response is to be defensive, maybe instead of responding, you could give yourself a little bit of a break and then, or just ask the question like, hey, I want to make sure I didn't misunderstand what you were saying. Would you mind repeating that? Right? So it kind of gives you a little bit of space and time to gather yourself, your emotions, and make sure that you're responding correctly. Now, hopefully, hopefully whatever was said is not being repeated again in a negative way to create more challenge. But at least you have prepared yourself and have given yourself a little bit of wiggle room to digest whatever's coming at you and hopefully to think of a better response, right? So again, it's important to know what is your emotional handicap. We all have them. And I think the interesting thing, lastly, about emotions, I want to make sure I'm saying this right. Emotions are just that natural, like visceral, raw reaction to something. If I'm quite honest, I don't really think our emotions need to be trusted in a lot of situations because often they are just very either savage or just very raw. And then on top of that, we'll experience emotions and then we'll add feelings. Feelings is kind of like a label to our emotions. So many times we can even mislabel our own emotions because our emotions are just very dynamic like that. Further in kind of further emphasizing my point that you want to be aware of your emotional handicaps and then come up with some better options and alternatives than expressing yourself in a way that's going to diminish your leadership influence and it's going to give into workplace hurts and create more of a firestorm.